Good morning. It's Thursday morning, August 27th, and it is morning manna time with me, Jerry Catherine. A brief moment at the beginning of our day before all the busy and the gray gets started, grounding ourselves in the truth that God feeds our soul in the very same way that God fed the souls and the physical bodies of the Hebrew people as they were wandering in the desert in Exodus 16. Back then, God poured out just enough manna from heaven to feed the Hebrew people for that day. So we believe still that God gives and provides for us enough manna for just this day, giving us enough good stuff every morning to sustain us throughout our day. We again are in Matthew 1 through 17, picking apart Jesus's family tree, trying to understand why would Matthew include this in part of his gospel. Monday, of course, let's back it up to that day. We remember that all the people in Jesus's family tree have a story, and that their stories are testimony to God's faithfulness and God's timelessness. Tuesday, we remember that God took on human flesh in the person of Jesus, and that tells us that God experienced through Jesus all the good and bad and ugly of life, so that we know our God really gets us, gets all our struggles, and even gets all of our successes. Wednesday, we looked at all four of the five women in Jesus's family tree, remembering that Jesus came for all, welcomes all, includes all, and loves all. And today, once again on this Thursday, we are back in Matthew 1 through 17. Let's call this the Ancestry.com of the Bible. Here we go. An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah and by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Minadab, and Minadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon, the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiad, and Abiad the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azar, and Azar the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Ahim, and Ahim the father of Eliad, and Eliad the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom Jesus was born, and who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So, confession time. I am a perfectionist. I am, of course, a recovering and at times high functioning perfectionist, but a perfectionist that is really hard to keep under control on the very worst of my days. On those days, I tend to really beat myself up for all my faults and failures and feelings of never ever measuring up and even have the hope of measuring up. It is easy to feel that way as God's people sometimes, don't you think? We know that intellectually and with our minds, we have been created in the image of our perfect, very perfect God. And it is easy to feel like we are really living a far, far away from that perfect image in which we were originally created. Here, however, in Jesus's family tree is hope for all of us who consider our selves perfectionists or never really feeling worthy or ever measuring up to the standards of God. Out of the whole list of ancestors, only Jesus can claim true perfection. And yet, in Jesus's lineage, each person had a purpose, was used by God, even if they did make some pretty heinous mistakes. And they really did. God never gave up on them. God's grace, Matthew 1 through 17 tells me, is greater than any of our sin. And God has promised since the beginning of all things to never let anything, our sin, ourselves, or anything, separate us from our Creator. And some of those in Jesus' family tree really did some pretty bad and awful things. Actually, not a one was without blemish. And that's why we needed Jesus after 14 generations and 14 generations and 14 more generations. Think about this and go back and read these stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were all big fat liars. I'm not talking little kid white lies. I'm talking big adult lies that had major consequences. And think to the story of Judah and his brothers. They together faked Joseph's death and told Isaac that Joseph was dead, and then they sold their brother into slavery. David and Tamar, well, those two were adulterers. Oh, yeah, and that King David, he was a murderer too. Solomon, he had lots of wives and concubines, and he allowed them to worship other gods. Rahab, she was a prostitute. Rehoboam was responsible for splitting Israel into two nations, two kingdoms. Unlike Abraham, who did not follow through on sacrificing his son, well, his ancestor a few generations later, King Manasseh, well, he went through with sacrificing his son to an idol nonetheless. Ahaz, he worshipped Assyrian idols, and well, he too also sacrificed his sons plural, many of them, sacrificed them. Should I go on? Or do you get my point? Jesus' family tree was not one of any kind of list of angels. It was a blend of all kinds of dysfunctional. But it's the kind of dysfunctional that God somehow, beyond any of our own human effort or capability, it was a kind of dysfunctional that God was able to make functional. That God can use because God sees each person with God's eyes, through the eyes of love. Only by God's grace, only by God's love can our rough edges be smoothed out so that we can be made into just what God needs each one of us to be to touch lives around the world. God sees us as we are before we see it in ourselves, as good, as worthy, as loved, and as beloved. You have probably heard this. God doesn't need your ability, just your availability. Well, that is evident right here in Jesus' messy family tree of a bunch of imperfect people with very scary skeletons in their closets. So remember today that we worship a God who loves you, a God who made you, a God who knows you, who loves you, and who can and will use you for great things. So today, again, breathe in, God is faithful, and breathe out, God is everlasting. See you tomorrow. It's Friday.